Already? The mic is on? Good morning and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. We're talking just outside that there's probably few topics that unify the concerns around the world than compared to workforce development. No matter what country you're in, question of how to prepare workers for the changing environment and needs of jobs is one that is at the top of policy concerns around the world. The question is how to do it. There doesn't seem to be any magical solutions, and everyone seems to some extent be struggling with this. So it's really a unique opportunity when we can bring together experts and experiences from different parts of the world, in our case from this hemisphere, to really exchange ideas and learn from each other. So we have really a wonderful panel to do that today. Our friends from Brazil will bring their experience, and we have here Frederico Lamego, who is the executive manager of the National Confederation of Industry, where he's responsible for coordinating international business strategies for the National Service of Industrial Training, SENAI, the Industry Social Services, and the Ubaldo Lodi Institute. In this role, he establishes alliances and projects with international organizations in the fields of technology, technical and vocational education, among others. Before this, he was the manager for strategic planning at SENAI and a strategy consultant for various public and private organizations in Brazil. He has an MBA from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation and a master's in financial economics from the University of London. To my right, Brent Parton is the Deputy Director at the Center on Education and Skills with the Education Policy Program at New America. His work focuses on federal and state policies to build learning-based pathways for economic opportunity and ensure their quality and relevance. Before New America, Brent served as a senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Labor, where he advised on a range of skills issues such as apprenticeships and industry workforce partnerships. He also worked at the National Governments Association and at the World Bank, where we coincided for some time. He was young, I was old, but we did coincide. And finally, Eric Selesnow, who is the senior advisor for Jobs for the Future, a national nonprofit that develops programs to build a more skilled and competitive workforce. He contributes to their work on apprenticeships, school reentry mechanisms, and sector strategies. Before that, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Labor during the Obama administration, where he worked to implement the administration's vision on skills training and workforce development. He was also State Policy Director at the National Skills Coalition and served as Executive Director of the Maryland Governor's Workforce Investment Board. Unfortunately, Marcio Guerra from SENAI couldn't make it, so last minute change in the program. As I was saying, the issue today is compare the experiences with workforce development in Brazil and the US and try to extract some common lessons from there. So let me start with Federico and ask him to please tell us about SENAI, what it is, how it works, how it approaches workforce development, and what have been its major achievements.
Okay, pleasure, Ariel, and thanks to have given me the opportunity to be here. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Let me talk a little bit about SENAI. SENAI is a private, non-profit institution that was created in 1942 by the Brazilian Confederation of Industry when Brazil was starting its industrialization process. At that time, we were in the middle of a war. The industrialists, they came to the government and asked the government to create a public institution to promote technical education. Instead, the government said, no, you, the industrialists, are going to create such institution, and we are going to provide a funding mechanism paid by you in order to make this model feasible in the future. So SENAI was created by a sort of a governmental decree. I would say that is one of the first experience of a public-private partnership in Brazil. And SENAI receives 1% of the payroll of all industries that have activities in Brazil. Okay. This stands for a budget nowadays of around $1.5 billion annually. It's the main, I would say, Latin American institution in technical education. We have around, even in the crisis that Brazil is just coming out from the past 2 years, last year we reached 2.7 million students in our technical educational programs. We offer courses for teenagers from the age of 16 till 21. This is our core. But we also have graduate and even PhD programs, usually on industrial areas. Okay? We have around 500 schools, more 500 mobile units, and because Brazil is a big country like the US, and we are pursuing to foster this agenda of technical education in spite of the rapid changes that we are seeing in the industrial market. Now, one of our big concerns is the fourth revolution that is coming, and it's already affecting jobs in Brazil. But in spite of that, we are trying to push this agenda because Brazil has still gaps in terms of pushing the agenda of technical education. I was talking with Ariel before that 2 years ago, we were on the peak of the last government's initiative to boost additional funding for technical education. So besides the 1.5 billion that we received directly from companies, the government injected extra billions of dollars in technical education throughout Brazil. And we reach only 9% of the young from this age of 15 to 21 doing technical courses. And if we compare to European standards, and not even to Austria, which is around more close to 80%, we still have a huge gap to move along. I would say that SENAI has, because of our age and because of our mission, we have been quite successful in terms of fostering this agenda. We are recognized in Brazil. Having a diploma from SENAI is something that has still a lot of value for companies. Our main success, I would say, is based on the proximity, the relationship that we have with the industrial sector in Brazil. For every program that we develop, and we work in 28 industrial sectors, we structure what we call sectorial committees, where we bring representatives from the academia, representatives from the unions, but also from the industrial sector, and they are the ones that define the skills of the future in Brazil and how we are going to certify and recognize those skills. So this is part of, and those committees, they meet twice a year to validate jobs and skills that are going to affect the market, and this is a sort of a direct input for SENAI to restructure the offering and of our educational programs nationwide. Okay. We have also, thanks to our size and reputation, quite a big international agenda. We help to create and design most of Latin American technical educational institutions that exist. So, for example, if you go to Colombia, the main technical education is SENAI without an I, because they do not work only in industry, they work in other sectors. And SENA's model, although they are public, they created a sort of a tax funding in a similar way like ours. And we do a lot of exchange programs with SENA's teachers in many areas. If you go to Peru, you have SENATI, even the names. If you go to Panama, we are now structuring INADE, their job foresight center that is one of our methodologies that we offer to other countries. We are structuring this in order for them to reorganize the offering of educational programs. And plus, we have 10 schools already built in other countries, especially in Africa and in Latin America, funded by the Brazilian Agency of Cooperation or by local governments, or even through triangular initiatives. I could spend the whole morning speaking here about our educational programs, but I leave you for future answers. In the past 6 years, we took a big initiative to create a new agenda in Brazil. This is something that no one would imagine that a technical education would be able to implement such initiative. Because of a demand from the Confederation of Industry and because of our stuck productivity levels Brazil has the same productivity level as the past 20 years. The industry asked SENAI to create a network of innovation institutes to do applied research for industry. This is our new business nowadays. In order to do this, so imagine a technical education institution with a hard DNA on hands-on and manufacturing, now pursuing an agenda of applied research and innovation for industry. We took a loan in Brazil's Economic and Development Bank of around $1 billion. Our numbers are always big because we're a big institution, to implement a network of 26 innovation institutes together with 2 international partners. We came to Germany, Fraunhofer, and we came here to the US with the MIT. And in the past 6 years, we are trying to create a set of structure facilities that will be able to offer and develop applied research innovation projects for companies. These are not spaces for technical students. This is a complete separate business on areas of knowledge that were unique for Brazil. So last year we inaugurated an innovation institute in laser technologies in the south of Brazil. We also inaugurated an innovation institute in electrochemistry, another one in cybersecurity. Those are topics that are related to challenges of the manufacturing of the future that will demand a new response. This will also have an impact in the offering of our technical programs as well. So this is the challenge that we are now trying to pursue in Brazil. In one way, trying to maintain the technical education agenda, and we think that we are being quite successful. The students of SENAI, usually in international competitions, we do quite well. And the last competition in world skills that we usually lose to China or to Korea, we are always number 3rd. In Brazil, when we were number 1st. But the agenda is going, and we are looking for new funding because we have huge challenges in Brazil to expand and to also for the young to put more value on the technical careers. And on the other side, we are trying to push this innovation agenda. After 6 years, we have already 21 out of the 26 innovation institutes operational, but it's a huge challenge to find the right people to do the effective projects, applied research for medium and small-sized companies. We are not looking for disruptive innovation. We are looking much more for problem-solving of companies in order to maintain and push the industrial sector forward in Brazil.
Let me ask you for some explanation on how is it that, what's your approach to ensuring quality and relevance of the training, given that you're such a large organization, and it doesn't seem to be working through competition in the market with other providers. What is the mechanism that really ensures that the training that is being offered is of high quality and relevance to both students and future employers?
Oh, that's a very good question. The first one is we conduct an annual research where we try to analyze what happened with our alumni that did courses in SENAI, especially the long-term programs. Last year, 65% of our alumni, they kept their job, which is something important, or they found new jobs related to the industrial expertise, or they maintained their salaries. Because this is one of our key indicators of success. Before the economic crisis, this result, we usually vary between 75–78%. So 75 to 78% of our students were finding jobs in the industrial sector in Brazil. So this is one of the keystones that we try to evaluate quality standards, because everyone that works in technical education knows that you need to be in line with industrial demand. So if we know, first of all, that our work is, our student is finding good jobs and maintaining their salaries, I mean, we are doing, first of all, the correct thing. We also hired external institutions to do an evaluation of our curricula and also the quality of our teachers. And this we have huge challenges as well, as being a big nation that has a lot of disparities between states in Brazil, as you probably know. So this is a still challenge. So what am I saying? If you go to SENAI in São Paulo, we have high-tech, high-standards technical schools. Only in São Paulo, the state of São Paulo, which is the size of France, we have 90 schools. And they're pretty working in line with industrial demand, because the industrial demand, it happens in practice, I mean, on a day-to-day basis. But if you go to the north of Brazil, for example, and I was saying before, because of the crisis, and sometimes the government is trying to do a new huge infrastructural project that you need qualified labor, and then we come to train the labor force. And we have huge gaps in terms of finding teachers, designing the curricula, but also maintaining those teachers, because our budget, we are a private-run institution. So part of our budget returns to the states that contribute more. So this is a huge challenge for us still. And a third element is that the Ministry of Education in Brazil also regulates the technical education. 7 years ago, under President Lula, we cannot speak too much about Lula nowadays in Brazil, as you probably are aware of, but President Lula, his only diploma was a certificate from SENAI. And he pushed a reform in our system, which were very important to us in a sense, because he obliged us to transform 2/3 of our budget. We are now obliged to convert this into free educational programs. So this is more or less how we work. So, and the Ministry of Education regulates and it monitors in a very sophisticated system how much of the budget is transformed into free programs. And it's a very interesting thing because when we were negotiating with the government and we had the risk of becoming a public entity, and this was the threat that the government posed to us back in 2008, 2011, the biggest challenge was not to have many free enrollments. The government says, we are not worried about the quantity of enrollments free that you're going to offer to society, but instead, we want budget, because if you say that you are private, you should be more efficient than the public sector. So we are going to always compare your figures in terms of number of enrollments to the public sector that also has its own network nowadays of technical schools to see if you are private, but at the same time, you keep offering free programs in an efficient way. So this is one of our quality standards at the same time. And if we measure that with the number of students that are finding jobs at the end of the day, and this is part of research, in a way, we are trying to boost social development in Brazil.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we'll come back in the discussion to this issue of quality assurance. Let me now turn to Brent. And this theme of public-private partnerships lies at the core of any workforce development issue. Clearly, the US and Brazil have very different traditions in this area. Can you tell us a little bit about your reading of the key lessons on effective public-private partnerships for workforce development, and perhaps some reactions to what you heard on the Brazilian model on that regard?
Sure. Well, thank you as well for having us here for this discussion. It's exciting to hear about things going on in other countries, particularly Brazil, with a country that I would argue that there are similar challenges that we are facing. And so from the U.S. perspective, I'll say this just to kind of get a sense first of what problem are we trying to solve through public-private partnerships. I would say the U.S.'s landscape today is also the vestige to some extent of a system that was grounded in the immediate years following the Second World War. We don't have a large institution on par that sort of coordinates technical education, but our system today is one where after the Second World War, we had a lot of GIs coming home, and we had really the first time this massification of higher education in the United States, where the mission of our colleges and universities was really extended beyond just sort of training professionals to sort of building the core of the workforce. This was a time, though, when you could still get a good job in the United States or still have a career if you didn't go to college. So a large percentage of the population still graduated high school, so post-secondary education, was able to enter the workforce and get a middle-class, family-sustaining job. So you had sort of this dual system in a way. It's not the dual system the way the Germans and the Swiss would call it, but really you had higher education was doing a lot of workforce development, and our high schools were doing a lot of workforce development in that sense. This is a problem now. It's changed because the skills that are needed in our labor market today have elevated. So what we call today sort of the new minimum to access a middle-class job in the United States is no longer a high school degree. It's a post-secondary credential. So we are faced with this problem of we're trying to put more and more people into our higher education system, into our colleges and universities, because they know or they believe that's what they need to get a good job. But at the same time, you have a lot of people that are not getting through that higher education system, and they're even coming out. It can be costly, and they're coming out without jobs and without careers. So we have kind of this very narrow path to opportunity in the United States today that we're trying to figure out how to solve. Where if a student, right now you have, of all the high school graduates in the United States, we have record numbers going to college. Today it's just under 70% of all of our high school graduates each year enter college right after high school. Only half of them will graduate college within 6 years. And the numbers are much worse if they go to a technical or community college, and the numbers are much worse if they're a student of color. So we have this disconnect between the way that we're trying to provide skills and education for people coming out of school to get the jobs that the economy requires, and how well our institutions are producing people with those credentials. On the other side, you have employers. And they have a problem that they're experiencing this narrow road as well, where they have serious issues around finding talent. They have serious issues around retention of employees. The labor market is dynamic in that sense. And they also have big demographic problems in the United States today. Our workforce is aging. It's not quite as pronounced of a problem in other countries in Europe, for example. We do have an aging workforce. And we also have a more diverse young workforce. So employers are really trying to find ways, how do we partner with education institutions and get this more young, diverse talent? So on one end, you have this problem with what we call the pipeline of skills on the education side. Not enough people are getting through, and employers are not being able to access the talent that they say they need to compete. To solve this, we see examples across the United States of what we would call public-private partnerships between education and employers. Again, we don't have a large institution that's able to kind of coordinate this at scale in the United States. The delivery of skills education in the United States is highly decentralized, just like the way it is in general education in the United States. State, we have federal dollars, but state and local delivery is really key. So you have these examples of these great local partnerships, a high school, a college, and say a number of employers coming together, building a program, working together, and it looks great. The problem is scale, and we can't figure out sort of how do we sort of scale these partnerships in productive ways. So the first lesson that I would say, that I would offer here is the lesson that we're learned is that policy matters. We have to, when we look at public-private partnerships between education and employers, policy matters at different levels because business can do different things. Business can advise, business can fund, business can also help decide how education and training resources are used. So how do you use policy to leverage all of those different things that business can bring to partnerships with education institutions? So we look at our policy from a governance standpoint. We try to incorporate business both formally into the decision-making around how federal workforce or education dollars are used. So we have our technical education system that requires, for example, all schools to have employer advisory boards. We have our public workforce system that requires what are called these workforce boards that have to be majority business represented, and they're making decisions around how resources are used, at least in theory, I'll put it that way. Another layer of this is strategy, though, and Eric is, I think, much better well-positioned. He's taught me everything I know about this because he's built these partnerships, but it's not just what you say employers, the role employers should play, it's how you engage them well. So the strategy work of this is around what we would call creating an information-rich environment. So yes, education and training institutions can build curricula and programs. They can put them in front of employers and say, hey, is this what you want? But how do you do that well? How do you do that in a way that it's not just tailored to one employer, but it's tailored to an industry as a whole? So there's a lot of interest right now in the United States about how we use our policy to sort of bring together these partnerships at a regional level and support them with data and information and make them smart. And then delivery. This is the other piece. This is the new frontier for us, and Eric's going to talk a lot about apprenticeship. But I think we're in a point now in the United States where we've spent a lot of time figuring out how to engage industry. Now we're learning how to partner with industry to invest. So from engagement to investment is really this shift in not just working with employers as partners on the front end of how they design programs, but taking employers and making them actually co-producers of the talent and skills that we need, not just the endpoint consumers. So we're looking at policy, how to create incentives for that to happen. And again, Eric's going to talk a lot about sort of the exciting stuff on apprenticeship. But we're also looking at sort of how you can get students to sort of have these experiences, we call them work-based learning experiences often, as part of completing all education and training programs. So that's a new sort of frontier in the United States right now. The other kind of lesson I would just say is this point too around public-private partnerships is we focus on the public and private part. I think what we're learning in the United States, and part of this is because of this decentralized nature, is that sometimes it's the public and public part of the partnership that's harder than the public-private part of the partnership. So we talk now about this idea of a talent pipeline in the United States. And this is this idea that us as education and training professionals should think like business. We should think of talent as like a supply chain. We have primary schools, secondary schools, because part of this is this completion problem in higher education. If students are showing up to the next level and not ready for that, they're not going to be ready to be employed by the employers once the programs are completed. So how do you get all of the different education and training institutions to work in an articulated way together, form a coherent pathway? That makes sense, but that's very hard to do because you have policies that conflict with one another, you have public and private institutions that are trying to figure out how to work together, and on the other side, you have employers who don't want to spend any time thinking about this at all. In fact, they're often in this position where you have 4 different training institutions or colleges knocking on their door, all telling them, hey, we can give you the workers you need, work with us. And they're like, no, you need to work together. And so that's a big part of the problem that we're trying to solve in the United States right now. How do we align our K-12, kindergarten to secondary, with our higher education policy, with our active labor market programs in the workforce system? How do we align those all pointing in the same direction towards what the needs are of industry in a region? So the public-private partnership is, in some ways, learning how to follow industry together, which is hard to do, particularly when sometimes the incentives are for these institutions to compete with one another. And so that's something we're struggling with right now, too. I'll just remark quickly on a couple things then around sort of what we've heard from Brazil and some things I think we're sharing in the United States. We, too, in the US right now are undergoing a rediscovery of technical education, what is called a renaissance. Recently, the United States passed a major overhaul of its federal law around high schools and primary education. And for a long time in the United States, at least for the past 20 years or so, the focus has been college for all, college readiness. The job of our schools is to prepare students for college. This law did something in that it elevated college and career readiness. So it's saying that it's not just enough to prepare for college, but schools should be focused on helping people prepare for careers over time. There's a lot of work to be done to figure out what that means, but this rediscovery of the value of technical and vocational education in our country is something where now we're encountering stigmas, both stigmas by students that believe college is the key to the American dream, and then if you're trying to put them into technical or vocational education pathways, you're denying them that. So that's a stigma on one end, but also stigma of employers. For a long time, our technical and vocational education programs were maybe seen by employers as something serving the not top-ranked students. And employers they will always say, we want the best talent out there. So the public sector is having to deal with sort of these cultural stigmas that have built up around technical vocational education. And they're not contrary goals, and we can talk more later about sort of examples of how we're addressing that. But that's something that this country is wrestling with as it sort of rediscovers the value and importance and really tries to get more employers engaged in public-private partnerships with education, as well as get more students into these pathways that lead to high-demand careers.
Very useful, and the notion that you're dealing with a range of clients to this virtual workforce development system is, I think, a very important one. It's not simply just about the very narrow public-private partnership, dealing with a range of actors. Eric, the issue of apprenticeships. Everywhere around the world that I know of, there is increasing interest in apprenticeships as part of a workforce development system. Easier to say than to do it. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the U.S., your lessons from the experience in your years in the Labor Department and the future?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thank you very much for having us. And it was great to hear your presentation. I learned a lot. Very important. Brent emailed me yesterday and said he would probably take all my talking points, and he did. But I'll drill down just a little bit because I think a couple of the themes that Moran talked about were important. You know, a national system funded by the government to support industry at a national level. Really, some would say that's very important, very forward-thinking, and a way to standardize sort of skills and training across a range of people in the country to support industry. In this country, as Brent said, we're much more decentralized, right? We have, and some people want to keep it that way for a workforce development system. Some people don't want a national system. They say, well, our state knows better, or our community knows better, or our region is better. You know, we build boats differently in Florida than we do in Maine. Our manufacturers in the wine industry are different than manufacturers in different types of food processing, right? So there's really different thinking about how to customize these solutions. I think the other theme that I would want to draw on that Brent talked about was, you know, the way this country has not valued technical education, right? I think the country is paying for it a little bit today and making a lot of efforts to try to understand and improve technical education. The linear pathway, post-World War I and post-World War II, of, you know, secondary to the workforce, secondary, post-secondary to the workforce, has not been working in the modern labor market, and employers have been complaining about it for years, that they're not getting what they need from the colleges. So, you know, what is the solution for that? So to answer your question about apprenticeships, you know, it is a tool in the toolbox, and you're right, it's just one part of a potential workforce solution. It is not the answer for everything, but the history in this country for the last 100 years is apprenticeship in building trades and primarily operated by unions. Unions have figured out how to have an intermediary, how to have a training provider, how to get a pipeline of workers to meet industry need. There's a pipeline of need, and there's very targeted, focused training with on-the-job experiences and related classroom instruction. So in the US, the word apprenticeship is often used for many different things. And so that's a really important thing to understand as this country is transforming its apprenticeship system. Without going into too much detail, there is something called registered apprenticeship, which is more akin to the European models, and I'll assume some models in Brazil, which are a minimum number of hours of on-the-job learning coupled with 144 hours a year of technical instruction offered by different training providers, mostly community colleges, but labor union, training organizations, and a variety of other partners. So it's been operating under a law in this country since 1937. There's a lot of people who've benefited from it, and I think the unions in the building trades and manufacturing who have done apprenticeships say this works great for us. We've done it. We haven't had a lot of government assistance or help, and it's worked out very well for the industry in training exactly what they need and providing that training. Less than 1% of US workers have ever participated in that, and probably not a much higher number than that of US employers have participated in that. So that has quietly operated in this country for 100 years. So it's not been in healthcare, it's not been in IT, it's not been in the hospitality industry. It has been confined largely, not exclusively, but largely to building trades and manufacturing. So just in the last 5 years, there's been a big 5 years, there's been a huge transition in this country. The Obama administration, beginning in January 14, said they wanted to double and diversify the number of apprentices in this country. And why did they want to do that? Because the outcome, the outcomes for apprenticeship programs, entered employment rates, completion rates. Brent talked about completion rates from the university or community college system as not being the best. Apprenticeship had great completion rates, or equal to or better than 4 years, and certainly better than community colleges. Wages were an average range of $60,000 a year, and most importantly, the job retention rates of 90%, roughly 90%, were off the charts good compared to any other workforce job-related training program around. So at that point, the administration at that time in the second term was really addressing the skills issue in this country as an economic development and social development issue. And so the Obama administration decided to not only advocate and advance and try to double and diversify apprenticeships, but also invest in it, put the money where the mouth was, and put very historic investments in apprenticeships $265 million in this, in this country is not a huge investment, but it's historic and record-breaking in the U.S. Congress appropriated a chunk of money every year, $95 million a year. Those are new the last 2 to 3 years and projected for next year. So there is a national movement beginning in apprenticeship, right? That was, I think, instigated by a vision of that administration. It's continued by the current administration, who wants to continue to advance on-the-job learning. I think if we all agree that applied learning is good, right? We were talking earlier about blended learning, but applied learning, hands-on learning is good. And anybody who's done an internship or cooperative education assignment or any sort of on-the-job training realizes you're learning as much, if not more, most likely more on the job with supervision, with a mentor, with direction than you do in the classroom. So it puts out better workers, more productive workers. There's a pretty good return on investment, and there's really helps the industry advance their workers. So in this country, there's been that emphasis for the last several years. Now, it's still not nationally standardized, right? And I think those are really critical differences between the countries and how you do that. A focus on this country is a lot in industry associations, which are many and varied and local and state and national. And so you could have a manufacturing association in the middle of New York State. Then there's a National Manufacturers Association, then there's metal workers, then there's a range of different industry associations, some which are into apprenticeship opportunities, some that are not. There's some talk with the new administration to consider a new approach to apprenticeships. We don't know exactly what that means yet, but will involve more industry associations, which could be a good thing. I think a lot of folks in this country are concerned about maintaining quality, access, and opportunity in apprenticeships. The other point I think I really want to make, which I think is an important one, is a lot of the workforce solutions that this country has looked at over the years have been really focused on adults. So the average age of an apprentice in this country is 29 or 30 years old, right? In Europe, it's 17. I don't know what it is in Brazil.
16 to 21.
16 to 21, right? So your focus is on that. The U.S. workforce development system has really, most of the users of that system are adults, right? Most of the people in community college technical programs are 29, 28, 30 years old. Average age of apprentice is 29. The focus on career and technical education and apprenticeships for young people has not been there. Brent has written a paper about it. I strongly recommend looking at it, but there's an emerging movement to take apprenticeship into high schools and for young people, but there's not a national system, there's not separate funding for it, and to quote Brent, the states are trying to figure this out, right? And we see some great emerging models in youth apprenticeship across the country, but it's certainly not standardized, certainly the way I think that SENAI would approach it. But apprenticeship is a coming issue, and I think there's been increase the last 2 or 3 years. I think the continued focus by this administration and business leaders on it will continue to be important. But in the U.S., I think it's a slow-moving train in transition, but an important one. And this country has tried it before, back in early 90s and late 90s under President Bush and President Clinton. There was an effort to do youth apprenticeship programs that never quite got off the ground. But I do think, for all the reasons you both mentioned about the skills gap, the skills needs, the education deficit, completion rates, that apprenticeship is becoming more attractive to employers as a way to grow their own workers, right? Really customize it. There's a big issue in this country with employability skills, not just the technical skills, but the basic employability skills. You can integrate those into apprenticeship programs. Some organizations do it where they want to integrate safety, because on the job safety becomes important with the technical skills. So, but again, it's not a national model, right? It's also decentralized. It's also sometimes by employer or maybe a small sector. One of the most interesting things, if I can respond to what some of the things Federico talked about, was the sectors, right? You're looking at sectors on a national level. The U.S., most of our work, Brent alluded to it, is regional sector work, bringing the regional partners together, the workforce entity, the community or technical college, around a group of employers and have employers lead that process. But it's often local or regional. Sometimes it's done at the state level. I did that when I was in Maryland. But often where the real work happens is at the regional level. So there's some great customization and connection that really happens with that. It may not get to some of the national standards that I think Brazil's industrial organizations are looking for.
But we work also decentralized. It's more complex.
Yeah, and I know there's other resources going on there, so I think this issue is a great topic for discussion. But again, I also want to make the point that apprenticeships, registered apprenticeships, sort of the gold standard of apprenticeship in the U.S., most akin to the European system, is not the answer for everything, right? There are a range of workforce solutions to meet business need. Apprenticeship is one of them with very good outcomes, but there's innovations going on in the IT sector right now. There's probably innovations going on in advanced manufacturing all over the place in terms of job training. But these partnerships that make it go, and Brent alluded to, 4 different groups in a state or in an area that want to come together. There are some incredible partnerships going on in Southeast Wisconsin, in upstate New York, in boat building in Maine, in aircraft industry in Kansas. There's some really interesting things coming along. Again, regional, solving local or regional pipeline problems, not so much a national system, but really good local things going on that can address those things. And I think that's some of the future for this.
Excellent. And your point on the link, the focus on youth, is particularly important in Latin America, given the demographic transition it's going through, and the large number of what are called ninis, which is, it's an acronym for young people that are neither in school nor working, a major issue in a large number of countries in Latin America. So there's a strong connection there to be made.
Well, if I can, we have 2 challenges in this country, right? Is what do you do with high school students to meet employer need and prepare them for employers of the future? And the other is, and our term in the U.S. is disconnected youth or opportunity youth, or youth who are not engaged in work or school right now. And so 2 different solutions for maybe those folks, but a real challenge for both countries.
Terrific. I think this is a good time to open up for questions from the audience. We'll take a few questions, have a round of answers, and then go back. Let me start with you. I'll pick from various parts of the room. Do we have the microphones available? So, the lady here.
Thanks so much for this panel this morning. It's been really interesting. My name is Sarah. I'm a program assistant at the Global Fairness Initiative. We do international development projects, and I manage a project called Creando tu Futuro, which works directly with ninis in an innovative blended learning online platform that's all about workforce development and job placement. And one of the challenges we faced, I think, is something that you've all kind of hit on. Job placement is really hard. It's been, it's been hard to get students to move through the program, and when they do, working with the private sector has been interesting. It's hard to get them to commit to opening up different slots. It's hard to get them to commit to students who are often from underprivileged, very at-risk backgrounds. So I'm curious, we're thinking about incorporating a mentorship and apprenticeship program. We're piloting it in the next year. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more in depth about maybe some of the successes you've seen in apprenticeship activities, or how you've been able to bring in private sector companies to commit to working with maybe at-risk youth or at-risk populations, or students who may not necessarily be going for the really high secondary degree.
And may I?
Sure.
In this country or other countries?
I'm particularly interested. We work only in Latin America, but I think that the U.S. plays an incredible role in kind of feeding the conversation.
Eric, perhaps what we do is we gather a few questions, because I suspect that there's going to be overlap.
Perfect.
And common questions. Let me go to the back.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Alejandro Espina. I work for the OES in the labor and employment section. And one of the things that we do is bilateral cooperations between the countries of the region. And actually last year we had a cooperation between the Ministry of Labor of St. Kitts and Nevis, and the US. And one of the conclusions of the cooperation was that private sector engagement in apprenticeship programs and basically in all the labor efforts for the countries is really important. So I think that's now a statement from the region, and is that private sector engagement is crucial for the development of the economies and our workforce in the Americas. But my question goes more into how do we engage the private sector? How we make attractive to engage in apprenticeship programs, in workforce training, so that they can have the talent that they need. Because that's one of the things that all the region says. We don't have the talent, and then the youth is saying we don't have the jobs. So how we close that gap between not having the talent and the youth not being prepared enough to confront that challenge?
For efficiency, let's, given that you're already there.
Thank you very much. Sitsi Moran, from former Inter-American Development Bank colleague, and now studying my PhD, focusing on education policy. I have had the luck to work with technical and vocational education programs in Mexico, and I sympathize very much because I do recognize all the virtues that this type of programs have, especially for disadvantaged populations. At the same time, and I recognize from what Brent and Eric mentioned, I feel that it's very hard to change the paradigm. It's very hard whenever we still have analysis that prove that in the long term, the returns to TVET are just not gonna be the same as the ones from college education. It is very hard whenever you have this aspirational issue from disadvantaged populations trying to access higher education, traditional college education. It is very hard too whenever, even if employers are willing to employ these graduates from apprenticeships or from training programs, it is the graduates who want to continue into higher education. And then the whole purpose or the value of the program sometimes is questioned because they are not gonna be employed. So any views on that will be highly appreciated.
Thank you. Let's go over this section here.
Hi, my name is David Morgan, and I work for Banyan Global, and we are currently implementing a large-scale workforce development program in Honduras. And I had a question specifically for Brent, because you had touched on stigmas. And as you know, a key part of any workforce development program is recruitment and retention of young men and women into your program. With this stigma of if you're a young man or a young woman without a college degree, you can be looked down upon, you can be undervalued, and I don't think a lot of youth really want that stigma. So how do you specifically get around that stigma and motivate young men and women to both join your program and to stay in your program and stick it out until they become fully employed?
Thank you. And the lady, yeah.
I'm Amy Firestone from the Department of Labor, and I'm in the Office of Apprenticeship. And my question is more for Federico from Brazil. I'm interested to know about the challenges that Brazil faces similar to the US with diversity and inclusion, especially with training programs, and what solutions that Brazil has come up with. And what training program has best suited working with demographics that have been vulnerable to other issues, gang violence and other issues that you face in Brazil similar to the US?
Terrific. And just for fairness, we need to go to the section.
Thank you very much. I'm Shannon McGarry. I'm with International Youth Foundation. We've been actually looking at this issue, looking at how we can learn from the South, and particularly Latin America, around youth reconnection and what lessons we could sort of glean to bring back to the US. So thank you. This discussion is very relevant. I think one of the questions and some of what we've been learning about some of the work and approaches in Latin America is sort of this idea around employer engagement and some of the investment that they're doing, actually sort of financial investment, beyond just sort of advising around what kind of technical skills and curricula might be most important for helping youth sort of enter the job market and have relevant skills and credentials. And I think that's been something that I'm not seeing as much on the US side, not that it doesn't exist, and part of it's the decentralization, but I'm curious to know if you're seeing that, how you're getting employers to sort of buy in and invest, whether that's putting dollars into help to train, or actually sort of helping to sort of finance these operations so that it doesn't just fall to the public sector, where you're sort of getting investments that are happening from granting and from nonprofit sources, but really getting employers to buy in and put their money to help have the trainings and the pilots. And I think that this is some of what, with registered apprenticeships and some of what labor unions were able to do historically, but certainly that's not where we are today. So I'm just kind of curious to hear some of what might be happening in that space.
Good. There may be other questions, but let me stop here, and if we are efficient, we'll come back for more questions. Let's reverse the order of the presentations and start with Eric. I think there were at least one question that was.
I was going to say, do you want me to answer all of them? Or?
No.
Well, I think the theme here, you can't do any of this work without employers, right? You're an employer consortium in Brazil, right? And so all of this work is about employers, not addressing the supply side. I mean, addressing the supply side is important, but really you have to engage employers, and I think that was several of the questions here, right? Up front, we have to make it easier for employers. They're running businesses, they're not social programs, right? The other challenge we have is that, the global recession of 10 years ago really showed even more the youth unemployment crisis around the world, right? Some countries wanted to do workforce programs or apprenticeships to combat violent extremism, some to fight gang wars, some to just engage youth more because these unemployment rates were so high in so many places. At the same time, employers had huge needs, right? So a lot of it is about employer engagement, and that's not an easy thing to do, right? But we have to make it easy for employers. And in some of the learning we've done around apprenticeship in this country, or the workforce system writ large in this country, is a range of intermediaries who can help employers do that. So is it an industry association that does all the heavy lifting and brings employers together? Is it a social organization? Is it a human service organization? Is it a local industry association? But how do you bring employers around the table, guide them through a process of what their common challenge is, and there are processes for doing this, right? You do it at the national sector level, right? What are the skills and competencies you need? How can we provide workforce solutions to do that? How can we work with youth? This is not the employer's problem, but once the employers identify skills and competencies, I mean, they need skills, competencies, and workers. They're not running social welfare programs. They're running businesses, right? They do want to participate in communities. They do want to help. And employers across the world that I've talked to say, it is our obligation to get involved with the school systems, not wait until, in this country, we often wait until students graduate from high school or graduate from college with no skills, and then we say, they're not very good in the workforce, right? In other countries around the world I've talked to, and some in the US, want to get involved in secondary, want to get involved in community colleges and colleges to help grow their own and train their own workforce. I think there's a theme of what is a common pain point for employers, how you organize them. I mean, you can't have really any workforce development program. The mistake that the US did for probably 30 years, up until maybe about 5 years ago, and we're still struggling with it, is we would just throw training programs at people and hope they got a job. And there was no assessment of the demand-supply equation. And so the demand of what the employers need, understanding their labor market information, their skills, the competencies they need, and how people like us can craft solutions for them become important. But what's really important is how you engage and organize them to be part of that. So it's a supply chain. They're a customer. Brent referred to a supply chain of workers and skills, how you engage them in that process, because they're going to be the end user for many of these people. And there are ways to do that. And I sort of simplify it up here, but there are ways to do that.
Brent.
Sure, and actually I'd like Federico to comment on their approach to this, because I think I'll touch on your question, but I think your question's tied to these other questions around sort of disadvantaged youth as well, which the issue of stigma in part is because we think there is one, in that we see these as two different paths. As Eric brought up, in the United States we have a lot of programs, And programs, because we're a big, diverse country, tend to serve certain populations, and they have those names on them, and that's a good thing, right? So we have specific funds in the United States that support training of disconnected youth exclusively. Then we have funds for in-school youth. We have funds for certain racial or ethnic groups as well. So that's good from a public policy standpoint, but then you kind of come to the side of the employers and how they look at this, and they're saying, oh, what are these programs serving? So there's a movement, I would say, in the United States to, the word is kind of hide the wiring, is what they call it. Apple has this nice, beautiful interface, but there's a very complicated technical machine behind it. Employers just need to see the interface. They should not necessarily have biases, although they do. Let's acknowledge that, against sort of where their talent comes from. But if a student or a young person is coming to them with certain certifications, with certain credentials, how they got that should not matter as much, although we can acknowledge it does. So there's this problem around sort of how the money moves and programs and who they serve, and then what employers see. But the bigger issue, and the one I want to hear Federico comment on, is this issue of permeability. And how do we make sure that people, even if they get their skills in one type of pathway, can continue into another, can transfer those to go into the mainstream college pathway over time? And also, I'll use the example of this around some focus groups we did as part of our report on youth apprenticeship. We held these focus groups with high school students and high school parents across the country. And we were like, okay, we know we live in a college for all culture, but what do you think about this youth apprenticeship idea? What do you think the idea before you graduated from high school, you going and working part-time, going to class part-time, and you come out, you have no college debt, you have a job, and you have some college credit and credentials. What do you think of that? They loved it. And then we asked them, okay, what do you love? And they said, I love that it gets me to and through higher education. Exactly. And I know there's a better result on the other side. So we need to stop talking about vocational education as if it's different than post-secondary or higher education. Because the reality is, in this labor market, you can't succeed without post-secondary education. So we have to view our vocational and technical education pathways as post-secondary pathways. And when we do that, that means putting real post-secondary credentials behind them, not alternative ones that only a program would recognize, but something that the local college or university could say, all right, you got your skills, you'll go work, but if you ever want to come to higher education one day, we'll acknowledge those skills that you built. We're working on that in the United States. This comes back to this hard part of the public-private partnership, is sometimes public to public, is getting our skills-based pathways and our more general academic pathways to talk to each other. So this idea of permeability is something the Swiss system has done much better than anyone in the world, I would argue, is that you can start in vocational education, learn with your hands, build skills, get work experience, but you don't have to stop there, that you can go on, that there's a future down the road. That helps with the recruitment end, we found, is that if you're telling parents and students, this is not just an alternative to higher education, it's a way through the college dream. That's something they like. It's a better way through because it has a job on the other side. It's something they like. But it also helps with the stigma side on how employers see these programs. Because employers are just really concerned about what's the skills that I'm getting, what's the workforce that I'm getting. And if everybody has a post-secondary credential that kind of looks the same, then it's harder for employers to discriminate. I'll just say one more comment on your question around financing. We don't have a skills levy or a payroll tax that supports skills funds in the United States. Some states do, few, and it's not a ton. So we do not tax our employers for workforce and use those resources. Unions played that role in some industry sectors a while ago. Unionization's gone down in the United States. But looking at this question around financing work-based learning apprenticeship, how do you get employers to have skin in the game and have shared investment in the success of someone? If they are paying for someone's education while they're already working at the company, they really start to care that that person gets skills to do the job and become a productive employee, so they see a return on that investment. So that's the one lever around sort of how you can kind of sell this work to employers and get them to reinvest funds in that way. That's the equation we're trying to figure out. It's not scaled yet. And then the other thing is around just job quality, and what does a quality job mean? Part of that now we're trying to figure out is how the skills you build on the job, how an employer invests in your training and your development, understanding you won't work there for 30 years. That's a sort of shattering of sort of a reality that was the case in the United States, that we're all going to be changing jobs more and more frequently, and that's going to happen even more and more with technology. So how do we make skills building, how do we get education institutions to recognize skills that people build on the job a part of what a quality job means? And that's a cultural shift as well that we're kind of going through. But so those are a couple of just generic responses to the financing question.
There you go. There was a question directed to you and another question directed to you. Some general comments. So,
first of all, just to clarify, we are a national institution, but we work decentralized. Okay, because Brazil is a big country. We have 27 states, and each state we have 27 SENAIs, and they work in line with local industrial associations that elects the national representatives of those associations. In order to answer a little bit about your question, Brazil has a lot of social inequality, first of all. So this is a big issue for us to find and to train people to find good jobs. And how? 3 years ago, the government that was in place in Brazil tried to launch a huge initiative called Pronatec to boost technical education, giving additional funding for institutions like mine, but other players in Brazil, to expand the offering of technical programs. At that time, we were very concerned, first of all, if we would train people to solve a social problem or to find the right jobs for those persons. Usually in my organization, we open at the state level, the city level, the school level, the offering of free programs. I told you that 2/3 of our budget are free. It's up to the school at the city level to invite candidates, and candidates either from companies or students, they come and they apply for the free programs that we offer. And we select the best. Usually, this is the criteria that we have been putting into place ever since our creation. The government created, as I mentioned, 4 years ago, this initiative, and they told us, you were not going to select the labor force that you're going to train. Like we, the Secretary of Education in each state, we are going to provide you with the people that SENAI would train in order to give better chances for them to open their view, chances of finding jobs. The result of this, in part, was not successful. Usually, what we found out was that people, even from low disadvantaged groups that enter in our programs, they were not able to find better jobs afterwards. Most of them, they were able to follow the training programs because they did not the minimum skills needed by the courses that we offer. So it's a huge challenge. I'm not saying that this is simple. One way that we did was, and this we do it in many states of Brazil, is that sometimes we have to invest almost 6 months trying to level the students in the teaching of even Portuguese, math, STEM, in order for the student, and we are talking about an emerging economy, it's different from here in the US, in order for the student to have the minimum capacity to, for example, we skills like electricity could help many sectors, but we train the students with a lot of contents about entrepreneurship in order for he or she to have possibilities to open their own business, and we're talking about very poor countries, in order to give a boost in their future careers. We clearly understand as well that technical course is not at the end line of the students. And the most successful cases that we have in our institutions are those students that a technical course is just the beginning of a very successful career. But we show, and this is important, we show annually that even certain professions in Brazil, they have better salaries than a bad degree from a college such as a lawyer. This is something that every year we do a sort of a national propaganda based on of our foresights, because we work national level to understand trends about future jobs, salaries, and what are going to be the market options for the young nationwide. And we give a lot of, we call the TVs and media in Brazil to announce this, but to show to the young that sometimes a person in civil construction can earn initially similar to an initial engineering degree in Brazil, or even better than a lawyer in Brazil, because everyone in Brazil wants to be a lawyer in Brazil. It's something because of our Portuguese, I think, background. And we want to show that this can be the start of a very successful career. So when we're talking about disadvantaged groups, we need also to look at the employer's perspective. One of the most successful initiatives that we did is SENAI has a national program, and it was adopted by most of our states in Brazil. That is a program that does all training for people with special needs. We have a lot of technologies, methodologies for those kinds of people. But why this program was successful? Because we have a law in Brazil that obliges companies to hire a certain quota of people with special needs. So we did a customized national initiative to meet this demand. So this is why, so we are at the same time solving, from our perspective, a social problem, but also focusing on the employability of the young. Because there is a law that supports, and we talk a lot about, here Brent talk a lot about why policy sometimes is important on this. So we have other problems because the participation of women in our courses is small, because we have a very manufacturing tradition-like situation in Brazil. We are trying to promote new ads, try to show that certain skills, they have more success in women than in men, but also reviewing curricula to attract the women. So if you go to our courses, for example, even in web, IT, or even in textile, we are looking a lot with design as a key component of those programs. And not design only as design, but design thinking and strategy design and other concepts. So this is part of the equation. So we do not have a sort of a fixed solution, a fixed answer. Depends on the situation. If we work, for example, in the north or in the northeast of Brazil, in very poor regions, SENAI is not going to be the best school that we have in São Paulo, for example, or in the south of Brazil. But we expect that the offering of program will give at least some perspective for the local population. And this means training based on the limitations of the input that you receive, which are the students at the end of the day. Last year, just to end, thanks to our lobbying, we did a lot of lobbying in Brazil because we are a very influential institution, now the Confederation of Industry. Brazil passed a new reform of its high school model of education, which is a big issue. While you have a big dropout in higher education, our higher dropout in Brazil is at high school. It's around 50%. According to the reform that is starting this year, schools all over Brazil will have 4 years to adapt themselves. Students will be able to find tracks. And one of the tracks will be technical school track. So for the first time, students will be able, for example, to enroll in a technical course during high school, and this will be part of their high school diploma. Until last year, what we did was different. So in the morning, the student did his high school. In the afternoon was one kind of offering that we do. The student could learn a technical career. At the end of high school, he will have 2 certificates, an apprenticeship certificate from us and a high school certificate from another career. But this was very tiresome for the student because the student would have to spend almost the whole day working. Usually we only start when he was already in K10, K11. But it was very hard for the students, so we only managed to have an average of 30,000 students annually enroll on those types of programs. Because usually our students, they either are concluded their high school or they are finishing high school or they are already working because of a necessity and they need to learn a skill like an apprenticeship. And our regulations are very Swiss German-like. I mean, they're very strict for the students to work inside a factory. So many answers, many ways.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes for a couple extra questions, but I ask you please to be very short and so we have an opportunity to answer. I know that I cut you off earlier and you after that.
I had a question about the U.S. In regards to why previous policies have failed. Was it a disconnection to the regional focus of reforms?
Okay.
And one more. And then the other question is, I work on a project, I'm Rosemary Garcia from Creative Associates. I work on a project as a director that is workforce development for youth at risk. The problem that we have faced in Nicaragua was not the private sector alliances or the willingness of the private sector to come on board, but it was more about the capacity of the youth to be able to stay within the programs. And I was wondering whether SENAI has a short capacity, more competency kind of training that goes along with youth that are just not equipped to be able to stay in a 2-year program or a 3-year program.
Thank you. And
my name is Michaela Weber. I'm from the World Bank Group, working on creative industries. So you addressed a few of my questions in terms of the future jobs, creative and design thinking. But I have a question. Are you using data to the sufficient degree to forecast skills, but also to look at what's actually out there and what people declare they have skills? So we, for example, work with LinkedIn, which is surely not the only data point and institution, but I think you mentioned it, the acceleration of development is just transformational. So we cannot use our past-based education systems and skills systems. Thanks.
very good. So there was a question that you were getting ready to answer.
Yeah. So, trying to remember what your question was, but because there's been so many good ones.
Why have we failed?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that we've failed. We haven't succeeded at scale. So I'd probably rather put it that way, because there are some bright spots of workforce training that has happened in this country for the last 30 years. Different policies have encouraged that. It hasn't happened at scale. And so there are best and promising practices in youth workforce development, adult workforce development, that has had the emergence of sector strategies, the emergence of career pathways strategies, the connection between secondary and post-secondary, some work on disconnected youth. I mean, there have been very many bright spots, but as often the case in this country, they're short-term funded, not sustained over a long period of time, and not a strong national policy to keep them going. And of course, everything in the U.S. policy is sort of, it's up and down, investment up and down, depends, who's going to focus on what. So I think there are a lot of bright spots. I don't think it's failed, but again, I don't think it's had success at scale in one universal system. And I think leadership matters a lot in this, and relationships matters. I also think probably one of the other big changes that has happened in the last 15 years of workforce, I'll go back to the theme again of employer engagement, right? The more you engage employers, the more you have employers working with you that are leaders to help advance that cause, that have either a common pain point or see the value of getting engaged with the workforce and education systems. And I think that's what's happened in other countries. That hasn't happened as much in the US, but I do believe that employers are now getting more involved with these systems, and their leadership matters, their influence matters, and then what's going to make or break the day is the workforce development supply side being able to craft solutions for businesses. If we fail at that, we get like one shot at the table with employers, right? So that employer engagement is critical. So leadership matters, relationships with employers matter, maybe even more than policy, but we certainly, as a point of policy, we want to give employers a way to engage. Leadership matters. And just real quickly on apprenticeship in this country, what has changed dramatically in 4 years is we now have 3 major global insurance companies, finance companies involved in offering apprenticeships. We have examples in healthcare and IT and a variety of different industries doing apprenticeships. So it's expanded as a model, not just stayed in one place. And so those businesses got engaged, had a pain point, saw value, and participated. There was a little bit of a policy infrastructure and a little bit of money that helped drive that, but mostly it was a lot of attention, communications, bully pulpit from leadership, both business leadership and political leadership, that really started that boat moving in a new direction.
I'll come back here, but I would say I think policies have failed to keep up, in the sense that we're still in a paradigm that we front load all of our education and training very early in life. Assume you'll get a job and you'll be fine for the rest of time. And as many of us know, which who have changed jobs, which I seem to do every couple of years, I guess, but it's not alone, but in the sense that skills development has become a lifelong process now. That will accelerate over time. There's a lot of conversations around the future of work. I think there's parts of the future of work that are here, in that employment learning transitions will become more frequent and accelerated over time. Part of that's technology, part of that's just labor market shifts. But so I think that our policies still assume, give you all the skills and all the learning and then get you out the door and you'll be fine. Whereas now, as the skills thresholds have gone up for the best paying careers in most places, our policies have not sort of adjusted in kind. So we're working on that. To the point on data, I think it's important to have a data-rich environment. LinkedIn's done a ton of work in the United States as well, but we have to understand that the best data we have still can only provide a snapshot of a moment in time, and it makes forecasting very difficult, and rarely do we have a full picture. So I think that the United States, what we're trying to do right now is use data as a tool, not a solution, in the sense that how do you take that data and then put it in the hands of regional collaborations between employers and schools and use it as a validation process and say, hey, this is what we seem to see in the labor market. This is what we seem to see in terms of hiring trends and jobs, and it's rich and it's sophisticated and it's detailed. But if there's not a process to validate and use that as a common language and negotiation point in these public-private partnerships, it's very hard to use it to act. And so I think I'm skeptical, I guess I should say, in one way, that data is the solution and will guide us the way. But I think it's very powerful, and we have such tremendous capacity now to get more data more often, more detailed. I mean, LinkedIn's done incredible things about being able to know where companies are poaching people from other companies. And if that isn't the best indicator of where there's true skills gaps, I can't imagine a better one. We can say companies don't want to hire this person because they don't have these credentials. Look at who the companies are actually hiring and stealing. That gives you real information. So we have these powerful tools, but if we're not putting it into the hands of the people that can actually make decisions and do something with it, it's not going to get us where we want to go.
Well, to answer your question, we have a job foresight methodology. We are working a lot with ILO as well. And we project jobs that are going to affect the Brazilian economy in the next 4 years. This is the horizon. A lot of use of statistics, a lot of use of surveys with industrial associations, and we try to indicate possible trends in terms of salaries, jobs that are going to be in line with market demand. And we join industrial associations, our strategic committees per sector, to discuss and to see if this is logical or not. As my colleague said, this is an input that we are offering for these industrial associations to see if we are projecting right. Answering your question, the answer is very difficult. I mean, we work on a very limited way on working to try to find solutions for very disadvantaged groups. Because our focus, our mandate is promote the competitivity of the Brazilian industrial sector in Brazil. We understand that our sustainability, our questioning of existence in the future, we all rely on the capacity to meet future and present demands of the industry in terms of job placement. We don't do job placement, by the way, like other Latin American institutions that we work with. We tried and we did some limited scales programs to try to sort it out very disadvantaged groups with very limited results as well. But the initiatives that were very successful and were the ones that have a lot of other safety nets around the initiatives in order to allow the students to maintain their focus on a training program, in spite of the many problems, external problems that he or she has in order to conclude a program. It's a huge problem in Brazil as well. And I was saying that the government launched this initiative 2 years ago to expand technical education. And they were the ones, the government were the ones to indicate the students that SENAI would be able to train. We were not given the options to select. Many students, they had sort of a precarious work, informal work, before coming to us. And they saw that they would come and they would find the solutions for their entire life by having a diploma at SENAI. What happened was many were able to follow the program in spite of us trying to level the usage of language, of Portuguese and math, because the problems are much more deep, as you know. And when he or she concluded a course, it came the economic crisis in Brazil. So sometimes our indicator shows that sometimes the results were even worse, because he had an informal job afterwards, and he or she was expecting to find a better job afterwards. And when he concluded, it became the economic crisis. We do not know, because it was very recent, if the crisis was responsible for the young not to find a job or not. Because again, and this is important, our offering, the quantity of enrollments that we offer nationwide, in state by state in Brazil, varies in accordance to the industrial development that is taking place. And so we cannot expand technical education very rapidly, and then suddenly there is a drop in demand. So as a private institution, we try to move on a steady way.
Well, thank you. Thank the panelists and all of you for what I believe was a wonderful session. I've heard a number of common themes that coming from both countries. The issue of financing seems to be important, and sources and means by doing it, governance with very different models in place, strategies for engagement, not just with employers, but not just with employers, or even just with training institutions, but also with students and trainees. The issue of connecting the various parts of the workforce development system, so that it is a system, and information not just for data analysis, but also for decision making, including by the users of the system. So I think there's a number, and I'm sure that I missed other common themes. This, in my view, reinforces the assumption on the basis of which we organize a panel like today's and many others, is that indeed the recognizing the many differences across countries in our hemisphere, there are a lot of common issues and lessons, both in terms of implementation, but also in terms of policies. And I think you all emphasize that the policy framework under which the programs and the initiatives operate is quite critical. So again, many thanks for your participation, for the great ideas that you put on the table. And I hope, as I always say in these occasions, that we'll continue the conversation. Thank you very much.